How should we treat people around us, especially the older and younger people, the vulnerable and the well-supported, leaders and those who are struggling? That's what we're going to talk about today in 1 Timothy chapter 5. I want to say up front that this chapter I find genuinely difficult, not because it's unclear, but because it requires us to hold these tensions between generosity and accountability, or between caring for the vulnerable and protecting the integrity of that care. And I take the stance that I stand at God's word with it. I try not to make excuses for it. And when it challenges me, I try to dig deeper inside of me to find out why it is. So let's go on this particular piece. Hi, this is Jill from the Northwoods, talking about Bible topics, one small chapter at a time. Paul opens up this chapter with this important relational map. Don't rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as you would a father. Treat a younger man as a brother, an older woman as a mother, and a younger woman as a sister, with absolute purity. The church is meant to function as a family. Families have a relational protocol. Jesus even said that. Who is my brother and sister? Those who follow me, right? Everybody, we are in a family together. So you don't speak to your grandfather in the same way that you would talk to a friend. You don't relate to an older woman in your church as you would your colleague. And the church, Paul is saying, should feel like a household in that age, and that relationship shapes how we speak to each other, how we listen to each other. And that phrase, with absolute purity at the end, is the flag. It talks about the whole line, particularly around younger women. Timothy is a young man, and Paul is not being suspicious of him. He's being pastoral. Guard your conduct. Let your relationship be clean and undeniable, right? We talked about that your reputation is above all, that no one questions your reputation in this. So now we go into deeper parts. The larger section in this chapter talks about the care to understand other people who are very different and on different positions in their lives. Paul spends time on the question of how should the church support widows? And the rule around it matters a lot because, first of all, the context in this first century Roman world is women had very few legal and economic rights. They had no economic independence. There were no pensions, no insurance forms or government assistance programs, Roth IRAs, retirement funds. Property rights for women were severely restricted. And so a woman without a family was vulnerable. They had no place to go and were potentially destitute. So the early church understood that supporting widows as a core responsibility of the church itself, and that's rooted in the Old Testament, where it commands care for the widows, the orphan, and the stranger. This is not a new theology. It is a covenant faithfulness expressed in practical terms. So Paul's trying to not limit compassion. He's trying to focus on it. Honor the widows who are truly widows. Honor carries that idea of financial support, not just respect, but how could you honor them if you're watching them live in the gutter, right? The first distinction we have here is widows who have family versus widows who don't have family. If a widow has children, grandchildren, those family members are responsible for her. Paul says this very plainly. Let them lean first on them to show their godliness for their own household and to make some return to their own parents, right? The responsibility is theirs to care for their own parents. Caring for an aging parent or grandparent is not optional. It is a part what we're responsible to do to live out our own faith at home. If a man doesn't provide for his own household, Paul says he has denied the faith, and worse yet, is an unbeliever. That is a really stark statement. The church is not meant to be a substitute family of responsibility. So we'll let the church take care of them. That's what they're there for. Instead, the need should be met by the family itself. Then the widow who is truly in need and left completely alone. There is no other family that she can put her hopes in. Her hope is in God, and she devotes herself to prayer, petition, day and night. She has no other recourse. She is entirely independent because there is no one else supporting her. That is who Paul is primarily has in view for now the church's ongoing support. And it gets more specific there. It talks about an enrolled widow. And scholars believed in the early church that this maintained that there was a formal order of widows recognized as a specific ministry role that they were supposed to commit to prayer, hospitality, care for the sick and the afflicted, raising children, and that it wasn't charity, but it was a partnership in ministry for these older widows. The church provided for them, and they served the community in return. The criteria Paul lays out for this enrollment is that they are at least 60 years old, have been faithful to one husband, known for good works, having raised children, shown hospitality, washed the feet of saints, and helped those in affliction, devoted herself to every good work. And I think, again, it's not necessarily saying, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that you had to be married, but you should have only been married to one husband. That's the idea. Again, faithfulness. Wash the feet of the saints. That's kind of an interesting language. In that day and culture, washing the feet of someone else was a task for the lowliest person in the household. Jesus did it for his disciples, and these women were doing it for other people. So their lives have been oriented towards service towards others, towards the community. And now the community has to support them so that they can, just live and eat and have a shelter over their heads. But now comes the younger widow. Paul's advice is a little bit different from them. He's like, don't enroll them in this formal order. The reasoning here is that a little bit pastoral, a little bit practical. Younger women still have other paths. They can remarry. They can still have a family. They can still be engaged and active in this world. He says to them, let them marry, have children, manage their households. Don't give the adversary an opportunity to accuse, meaning that some of these younger widows, once they're enrolled, have become idle. Well, now I'm just going to be the ward of the church. I can just be sitting around and eating grapes all day long. And he said that they have become interesting, going house to house, becoming gossips and busybodies. And if you ever watched some of the old TV shows, right, those busybodies who would say, did you just see what Bob just did? They walked around the neighborhood making sure all the gossip was spread around to every house. That appears to be what they were doing. And it's becoming a problem in this church in Ephesus. It doesn't sound hypothetical. It sounds like this is already something that is happening, and that some of them have turned towards Satan. This is a complicated passage because the young widows who want to marry would be received with condemnation for breaking this pledge now because they were enrolled in this widows program. And now later, maybe a few years after some, grieving inside of here, they've decided they want to get married, and now they're getting condemned for breaking their pledge. And this is where this interpretation sort of becomes interesting. If these women had made a formal pledge of celibacy or dedication to the church and joining this order of widows, similar, I think, to people we associate with a religious vow. The first thought I had when I was reading this, it made me think of nuns, right? But now they want to break it. They decided they want to get married. And so these are just simple young women desperate for, the social interaction, the economic interaction. They were younger. They can still pursue marriage. So that's why this relationship has become harmful to them and now is leading them into harmful disreputation. People are talking about them, and now they're also behaving poorly too. I think that that's the idea, is that when either way, Paul is concerned the same. Protect the women from this pattern that will someday harm them. He ends the section simply by saying that if any believing woman has a widow in her family, she should help them and not burden the church. the church can then devote its resources to those who are truly alone, truly in need, and have no place else to turn. Then it goes on to talk a little bit about the elders who rule to be considered worthy of honor, especially those who have labored in preaching and teaching. A double honor is included in this financial compensation, helping these people financially. So Paul is making this very clear. You don't muzzle an ox when it treads out into a field of grain. This idea, this is a little bit more complicated, comes from Deuteronomy 25:10, where Paul uses it now, and then Paul also used it in 1 Corinthians 9, that you don't deliberately ground the rights of ministers to be paid in the Torah. You don't starve an animal that's doing work, right? So in this particular case, the church people, the people who are elders and are unpaid in this ministry, should be paid for this. So Paul decided he wasn't going to get paid for his work, but that was his choice. People have a legitimate expectation to be paid. So I think that's where it's getting confused. If a worker desires or deserves wages, pastors, elders who work hard at preaching and teaching are those workers. So it's about, accountability. Don't accept an accusation against the elders unless it's supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. So that's a direct reference to Deuteronomy 19:15, where the Torah required that there would be witnesses before any sort of proceedings happened. He is not introducing a new rule. He is applying Israel's covenant justice to the church itself. Protection against false accusations. Elders in authority are targets of resentment, for grievances, for rumors of what people think might happen. The standard of witness is provide for the protection of these elders as well. And if the sin is confirmed, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that they, the others, may rest in fear. Public accountability for a public office. This is not optional. When a leader sins and it is witnessed and confirmed, silence protects nobody. We have seen that. We have seen pastors. I mean, there were pastors that I have liked, particularly book authors, and suddenly you find out, oh, they have had church accusations made against them decades ago and continuing all this time, and no one said a word. They didn't want to kill the fatted calf, right? This pastor's famous, is probably bringing in good money to the church. They like the fact that this person has a reputation and writing all these books, and then you find out that these people shouldn't have been pastors in the first place. And now you find out years later, it was kept silent. It harms the congregation. It emboldens bad behavior on other people. We have seen this today. And everybody, in authority who has done wrong should be outed, should be spoken about. And when that type of thing happens, the rebuke isn't about cruelty towards that individual, it's protection for the flock. It may also be, like in this particular case, when pastors are outed as being someone who did something wrong, there may be other people in the congregation who thought they were the only ones. No one was harmed in this particular way, but we had someone in my office that was mentally abusing people. And that person was very secretive about it. And the leadership was kind of secretive about it. And at one point, a brand new CIO or CFO came into the company. He's financial related, and he's got this vibe. Something's going wrong here. So he actually, with the HR director, called us in one by one. And then we said, yeah, that guy's been awful to us. And found out he was being awful to everyone, and it was being kept secret. We didn't know each other existed. So that's why this is really important, because there may be other victims out there too who need some form of counseling, for this particular piece. All right. And so then Paul charges Timothy solemnly before God, Christ Jesus, the elected angels, to do all these things without prejudice and without favoritism. So prejudice is not just what we think about as prejudice in our modern day terms. it means prejudging in either direction, for or against someone, just because you like them. Oh, he's a Roman, good guy. I'm a Roman. I like all Romans. Or she's a close friend of mine. We can overlook this misdeed right now. None of that. The standards must be consistent. Whether you're in favor of them or against them, you should have neither of that and treat people like they, should be treated. And don't be too quick, it says, to lay hands on anyone. Don't rush ordinations or appointments. We talked about that earlier in chapter 3. Don't fill a position just because you need someone in it. Putting someone in the wrong role of authority because you're just desperate to fill a hole in the chart of employees makes things worse, not better. I remember in my company, we were very careful hirers in that company. We wouldn't just hire someone unless they were a good fit. And I remember customers saying to me, well, at some point you just got to hire someone, right? And we were like, no, it's better to leave that spot vacant than to hire the wrong person in that. It's better to wait, vet people carefully, and let their character be revealed over some time. And then Paul pivots to something that's pretty personal and sort of touching in a very way. He says, stop drinking only water. Use a little wine because of your stomach, Timothy, and your frequent illnesses. So apparently Timothy had some kind of a chronic stomach trouble or a chronic illness. And Paul says in the middle of all this, hey, you know what? Take care of yourself, right? Drink a little wine. That will help settle your stomach. Back in those days, medical treatment was very limited. And in the ancient world, that fermentation process made the water a little bit safer. It killed some of the bacteria than raw water. It also was known to settle certain illnesses down. So travelers, sailors all knew this well, that water from rivers, cisterns could carry pathogens, and a small amount of fermented wine could genuinely be medicinal, not just for the alcohol killing bacteria purposes, but also medicinal for the stomach. So Paul's not endorsing heavy drinking. He's just warning against that in chapter 3. He is actually telling his young protege, tend to your health, right? You're no good if the church is broken down because your health goes down the tubes. He wants Timothy to take care of himself. So finally, this chapter closes with a principle that ties everything together. Sin of some people are obvious, going ahead of them into judgment. And the sins of others appear later. That we talked about that quiet sin you don't find out about until later. And the same is true of good works. Some good works are obvious right away, and some good works emerge over time. That's why we don't rush to judgment. That's why we have witnesses when we make accusations. This is why we don't appoint people who are brand new converts or brand new to our church. We want time to reveal their character. We want time to reveal who that person really is. It may seem that person is above reproach on first glance, might not be true. Or it might seem that a person is pretty unremarkable and maybe they're just quiet. They're the quiet pillars of faithfulness in the church, but you'll find out over time what kind of character that is. So basically, wait and watch. What I'm going to meditate on this day is, unearned provision. Paul is not talking about being stingy, to widows. He's talking about being careful with what happens with people when they receive support from the church that they haven't earned and maybe don't even need, or they have other places that they could pull those resources from, namely their family. Because when they do, what does it do? It encourages idleness. It encourages people going door to door and spreading gossip and being busybodies and self-indulgence. And the behavior not only harms the church, but it harms those widows as well. So we want to make sure that when we look at this, we can fall into patterns of giving without that kind of concern. People who consume without contributing. I want to think, I guess, where we nourish people, where we help them, and where people should be going to other sources or doing other things. And what I'm going to pray about is the church leaders, that they're good people, not only that they're good people, but that they're paid fairly, they're supported well, they're held accountable with integrity when that integrity or that accountability is needed. There are specific and real things to pray for in this church. And in a season when churches are financially stressed, under fire from the world and from whatever evil is going out there in the world, I want to be able to do better towards the people who give so much of themselves to the church. And what I'm going to share with other people is the idea that church leadership carries more than most of us realize. Elders, pastors don't just prepare for sermons, they prepare for decisions in the church. They oversee the care of vulnerable people. They navigate accusations. They make appointments. They carry the weight of public accountability. All of this is very difficult, and all this requires some wisdom and patience and extraordinary amount of grace for them to just do their job. So please pray for them, support them. If you see someone in need, help them out. If you see something in need of addressing, do it right away with witnesses, due process, without favoritism in either direction. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you being out there. You can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. You can find my other podcasts at jillfromthenorthwoods.com. All of my podcasts are both here on YouTube, on Rumble, and also in podcast form. Thanks so much. Have a great day.